Hello, and welcome to another episode of My Pocket Psych, the podcast all about the psychology of the workplace. I'm your host, Dr. Richard McKinnon. I'm a chartered psychologist and coach. And this episode forms another in this series that we're calling Thriving at Work, which is all about the different concepts and skills and ideas that can help everyone with their well-being in the workplace. And this time around, after a couple of episodes that I know listeners, well, they told me, felt were interesting but heavy. We looked at the menopause. We looked at feelings of ostracism and loneliness in the workplace. We're going to change the pace, change the tone. And today we're going to have a look at how to have fun at work. Now, before I introduce my guest, I just want to let everyone know that our new course is open now. I've made reference to it on a couple of the previous episodes. It's well-being focused, and it's called Thriving with Psychological Flexibility. And it's the first open access course we've run, meaning that anyone, anywhere in the world can sign up and take this course with us. It's a mix of self-directed e-learning content and participation in some live online workshops. And we start those towards the end of November. But purchasing a place on the course gives you access for 12 months. So if you can't make any of the scheduled events, you're going to be able to attend them in 2025. It's called Thriving with Psychological Flexibility. And I'm going to put a link to that in the show notes. So plug over. I'd like to introduce and welcome a new face on the podcast, Dr. Mike Rucker. Mike, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well.
It's good to see you again. I always ask my guests to introduce themselves, as it would be much more fluent and joined up compared to how I would do it. So could you tell our listeners and viewers a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So by academic background, I'm a charter member of the International Positive Psychology Association. My latest project is a book called The Fun Habit, where I looked at this idea of fun contrast to happiness and how, especially in the Western world, we kind of pursue happiness, and yet a lot of life is devoid of joyful moments, in the day to day, and then really unpack the consequences of that. So in the book, I playfully call it fun starved, but it's a lot more dire than that. The idea that, so many of us are mortgaging off these opportunities to enjoy our day to day are having profound impacts, with regards to vocation. We're seeing, record levels of burnout across all sorts of different jobs. And then just, in the family unit in general, because of, so many different headwinds, whether it be the information age and just the mass amount of data that we kind of need to consume day to day, to things like the sandwich generation, where our parents are living longer and our kids, are coming a little bit later in life. So we have, for the first time in any modern era, more domestic duties than we ever had. We just aren't living fun lives, and there are a lot of consequences to that. So that's been the bulk of my work.
Which is why we both thought this would be a great fit for the podcast, because a lot of the time people think about work, they think about surviving work, getting through work, or it being some kind of, well, it's necessary, but how could you have fun? So tell me a little bit about your personal/professional interests in fun at work. What sparked that for you?
Yeah, so I think it became essentially an extension of the original idea. So as, an early member of positive psychology, when that first came about at the turn of the millennium, it was a bunch of clinical psychologists that had gotten together where things like gratitude and mindfulness had been studied, but it really hadn't been looked at too much in an academic context. So they wanted to bring these tools to the masses, right? Because psychology up until that point had really been only used to treat clinical deficits. So I don't think there was anything wrong with the fact that at the beginning we focused on happiness because we weren't really talking about it yet. But what unfortunately happened over time is it appears that we overly focused on it. And especially as, sort of life coaches and practitioners latched on to some of these findings, we really elevated happiness as an ideal, which paradoxically started to make people a lot less happy because we weren't talking about what you could do in the moment. We were really getting people to think about, like, how do I compare against others, right? I mean, the World Happiness Index, as great as it is literally like, hey, is my country better than yours? Which
Mhm.
is sort of a weird concept when you think about the fact that most of us do, are looking for that rising tide to float all boats, and yet we're pitting one against the other. Not to mention, once you quantify happiness, right? What happens if you're like, hey, I live a pretty fulfilling life. I'm at a 9.5. And then modern life, like it does to everyone, throws its slings and arrows at you. And the only way to go down is down because you've kind of maxed out because we've set that mindset in you. And so at a personal level, that's where the journey started to
Mm.
unpack it. But then I am an organizational psychologist. And so naturally, I wanted to start looking at, the components of fun in the workplace as well. Because up until just recently, for the most part, it was sort of broad-based interventions that could be helpful, but they were really meant as advice. They weren't looking at effectiveness. We now know that certain icebreakers can actually cause moral injury as much as they look great when you read them. If you have a cohort of folks that are introverted and you ask them, divulge one thing that's secret that no one knows about you, like, that's not the place for that, right?
Yeah.
That, some of these folks are colleagues, but not necessarily friends because you haven't created psychological safety yet. And so, you know, there's obviously some pre-steps to being able to have fun at work, but it's important because the big idea here is that we know that folks that don't enjoy what they're doing ultimately feel depleted. It's one of the main culprits of burnout. And so figuring out what are the ways to get folks to at least enjoy some of their day, even if it's not at work, right? We talked about before we hit record this idea that sometimes fun at work is as simple as just taking your lunch break. If you're in crisis care, right? I'm not going to tell an OR surgeon, like, I'm going to turn you into Patch Adams. Like, that's just not realistic. And it's also toxic positivity, right?
Yeah.
But what I can tell you is that if you take a break and figure out what it is that recharges your batteries, is that because your wife is down the block and we give you the opportunity to have a nice lunch with her so that you can enjoy that space and come back and tackle the second half of the day, then we know we're adding an impact. But it is complex. And that's why I think it's important to talk about, because sometimes it's not about crazy sock Friday, right? Or happy hours on Thursday,
Yeah.
because those don't have much of an impact. It's about doing the deeper work and understanding how you can create an environment where maybe fun thrives despite what you think is enjoyable, but because as a leader, you're actually listening to the needs of others and creating the space where they can figure out what fun means to them.
What's really interesting to me in what you've shared there is we can start to see a sort of a gap emerging conceptually between happiness as future goal versus I can enjoy myself right here and now. I can have some fun now. I don't have to make a 20-year sacrifice before I can enjoy my life. And yet the focus on the happiness industry, if you like, is, you know, you'll get there at some point if you do all these things. What you're saying is it's a much more moment by moment experience. Is that a fair way of looking at it?
Yeah, it is. And actually, in real time, I've kind of, you know, I don't want to bounce around because, I'm jumping into the middle of a thought, but it's sort of like weight loss, right? It's like when, if you're someone who has some sort of intervention that promises happiness, you might actually arrive at happiness that day, right? But it still needs to be maintained because happiness is such kind of a loose, ambiguous concept, right? We define it in psychology as subjective well-being, but when we talk about it as kind of this thing, it means different things to different people. And
Mhm.
even if you arrive at it, and the reason I brought up the weight loss analogy is, yeah, maybe that intervention will get you there, but is it going to keep you there?
Yeah.
And so the idea with changing sort of the focus on fun is fun can be the long game. Yes, by nature, we know that fun is ephemeral, but if you integrate fun into your life by design, then you can continue to find it even, despite the days where it's not going to be there, where happiness is always this sort of mirage out in the distance. And
Yeah.
what we know is that because that is factual, right? That even if you do find it, it's going to kind of disappear and then again be out there on the horizon. That we start to look at that gap between where our feet are and where we think happiness is. And what becomes problematic, and it's quite insidious, is that if we start to really ruminate on that gap, then what happens to our identity is we're like, well, I'm never, in a good position to actually reach happiness. So I must be an unhappy person.
Yeah.
And once that grows roots, unfortunately, what we know about human identity, and it happens in the background, right, is that we want to strengthen that because identity makes us feel good. So we start to look for artifacts that, indicate like, well, just right now, I must not be able to create happy experiences or be a happy person. And that's where a lot of folks in middle age find themselves, right? Like this
Mm.
just isn't the period for happiness, which is so unfortunate because oftentimes if we look at the 168 hours we have in a week, all it means is reclaiming 3 or 5 hours of that 168, that you have to remind yourself you have the agency and autonomy, even if you do have a terrible job, to find moments of joy in your week. And the problem is when we are fun starved, we just kind of give up, right? Well,
Yeah, no.
obviously it's not accessible to me, or it's accessible to me, especially here in the States, right? Where we're, the second to last with regards to giving access to leisure anyways. It's accessible to me that one time a year. And then inevitably that one time of year when you book your amazing vacation, let's say in the Bahamas, that's the week it decides to rain. And then your whole year is jacked, right?
Yeah.
And so you just wait for the next one where we know, and again, this is empirically validated, it's not just conjecture, even busy professionals that have staunch guardrails, that have transition rituals where they're like, my workday is done. I'm just going to put my phone away. And this is time reserved for either, friends if they have hobbies or family or both, to be able to create that blend where they know that work is going to be there for them the next day, but they have time to recharge their batteries, are the ones that are the most successful.
It's an interesting exploration of these because I think for many people, they don't really look at the difference between these different experiences. But if you start to imagine happiness as an attainable permanent state, that causes all kinds of problems because as soon as you realize you're not feeling it, you have to do something to chase after it again, or you see that gap and that gap gets bigger, or you avoid things that don't result in instant happiness. So you think, well, it's not
You're not
serving.
disappointing, right?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
and then you can get into all kinds of problems and make the situation worse. Whereas if you're able to conceptualize this as I have agency, I have a sense of control, I can conjure up some positive emotions, but I don't believe they're going to last forever. They're going to last for this moment and I'll enjoy them. And then, then there's something less enjoyable around the corner. And that's fine too, because to know happiness, you have to know unhappiness. And to know joy, you've got to know an absence of that. And it's sort of looking at the bigger picture in a sense, isn't it?
Absolutely. And the agency part is important because I would reframe, the way you surmise just a little different in the sense that when those micro joys are there, instead of it is absolutely right because I know a big theme of your podcast lately is flexibility, and I'm a big proponent of that as well. So we need to know that we can navigate the unfun times,
Hmm.
but an important component to be able to do that is to know at some point I also can create another fun time for me. And so, for folks that are familiar with finite and infinite games, and life is an infinite game. So you need to think in that manner. It isn't something that you arrive at, it's something that you constantly create. And so when you live in that mindset, you're able to create this tapestry of life that has so many different benefits, right? Because one, we know once you start to index, memories in that way, like I have the power to do this. And now I'm engaging in things that are meaningful to me, whether that's, family or experiences or whatever it is. You create a corpus of neural pathways that remind yourself, like, oh my gosh, I have, this history of things that I've done to better myself. And so we know that adds to resilience. And we now know this is getting a little bit geekier into the neuroscience, but those neural pathways, right, when we're not living a habituated life, likely stave off cognitive decline because they create this scaffolding when life starts to pull away some of our ability to think. Apparently, that infrastructure that we built with novel experiences can be reused to kind of
Mhm.
keep us healthy later in life. So it's not just about working better, right? It's also about, living a rich, fulfilling life that behooves you once you're done working.
That's really interesting to me because I've come across research pointing to the same thing, that just introducing small amounts of novelty and actively seeking that out is so good for us. And again, it can be done in small ways as part of your routines. To shake them up a little is just really good for us. And those are the moments where we can look to both experience a sense of control or mastery or novelty or awe, when we experience something we've not seen before on our commute. So what we're not talking about is reinvent your life.
Not at all.
New
No.
year, new me. It's those small moments, those small
Yeah.
things where we've got an overlap, don't we? Conceptually, a little bit. What are the things you do for yourself when times are tough and you're dealing with adversity? What are the things you do for yourself to invest in your well-being when you don't necessarily need to, because you know you will at some point in the future? And that self-awareness of what works for you, understanding that rather than looking externally and saying, well, what do people do, what's good to do, but no, what works for me, and if it works for me, why not keep doing it?
Yeah, and I would even say entering a level of ambidexterity, right? So keep the 80% that's working for you. And as long as you're comfortable, allow 20% to be exploratory.
Mm,
And guess what? A lot of those are gonna suck, and you're gonna learn what you don't like,
yeah.
but the new novel things can be then integrated in that 80%, like, oh my god, the big one here in the States is pickleball, like, sometimes things, have their moment, but it's clear that, especially for 50 years and older, it's just so fun because it's easy to pick up, right? And, you get to engage in social fitness because you're getting to, select who you want to play with. So that's a micro example, but
Mm,
one where, that didn't exist 5 years ago. So if you never gave it a chance, you wouldn't know. Some people absolutely hate it. And so great, never play it again.
yeah.
That's not for you. Right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, but those things do become important. And it is kind of a heady topic, but someone much smarter than me, who's a neuroscientist, explained it to me this way. And it made a lot of sense. If you had 100 copies of the same book, would you keep all 100 copies, or would you throw out 99 and remember you had 100 copies, but keep that one copy, right? And that's how our brain works. So if we're living a habituated life where we wake up, make food for the family, go to work, the work is routine, same commute, back home, then rinse and repeat, we're keeping that one copy of the book in our brain. It's just one neural network. But if you start to do things that are a little bit different, even if that's, just outside of work, then you need a new volume for each one of these new experiences. So instead of having one book on your bookshelf, now your brain has a full library.
Mhm.
And I think through that metaphor, it's so easy to understand the importance of this, right? Because the benefit of a complete library of books versus one book, that does give a good kind of visual representation
Mhm.
of why this is important.
That's a really nice way of putting it. I can get that. So that's a good marker for it. In recent months, we've been focusing a fair bit on well-being for the cynics in the world. What's the point of fun when it comes to our well-being? Does having more fun improve our well-being in any measurable way?
Yeah, so it's clear that it does, right? We know that when you're in a positively valent state, you start to um, cool the limbic system, right? So we know there's a high correlation between folks that aren't enjoying themselves and feel stressed with things like autoimmune conditions and getting sick more often. So when our body is less stressed, we're just in a better physiological state to be able to stave off all sorts of different health issues. And then luckily, because this is the point where I give my little cognitive lecture, we've already covered that. So there's clear new cognitive science. Anyone interested in it, like just look at neuroplasticity, where getting to enjoy yourself, especially through curiosity and novel experiences, clearly has a positive cognitive impact going into things. And then I might be jumping the gun here, but it's also clear that folks that enjoy their work are the most productive. And so we trick ourselves into thinking that if we work late hours, that we're working harder. But
Mhm.
when you look at social scientists that do really comprehensive time use studies, what we're engaging in generally, especially if we work nonstop for like 4 or 5 hours, is what they call admin work. And admin work generally never moves the needle on anyone doing something significant with regards to their work product. It's usually, clearing your inbox or sort of following up on non-important issues, because anything important is going to require more cognitive capacity, right? And when we don't have that, there's some professions that are going to be exceptions to the rule, like accountants that really, benefit from heuristics and have a very algorithmic way to get through their day. They can grind it out, right? Because they have this map and they're able to get from point A to point B and be done with their day. But anyone in knowledge work, once you get to this, place where you have limited capacity, because you haven't enjoyed what you're doing, then you generally can't create anymore. You're not going to be able to
Mm,
work on a proposal.
mm,
And I think most importantly, what we're starting to find is that you definitely can't think in a nonlinear fashion. So if your vocation requires you to do any sort of thematic analysis where you're bringing in disparate information from things outside of your sphere of influence, which is where we see people really strive when they have this skill set, when you're not enjoying what you're doing, you just try and get the job done.
mm.
You're not going to sit and think, how could I better this system, or how could I do this in a way that's more innovative? And then another one that, has kind of been of interest to me too, is that when you're in that depleted state, you're almost always only accretive. You're like, what can save me from this situation?
Right.
Yet so many of us benefit from being able to have the psychological space to be like, what can I remove from this system? Or what is that thorn in my shoe that if I got rid of it would make everything better? It's really difficult apparently to get into that headspace when you are depleted, because we're just trying to alleviate, the situation we're in, instead of trying to take a step back and ask ourselves what can make the situation better. When we're enjoying what we're doing, we're able to do that. And then the
Mm.
last piece with regards to well-being isn't necessarily about ourselves specifically, but we also know through social contagion that if we're not enjoying what we're doing, we tend to pass that on to, both our loved ones and our cohort. And so you see through social contagion this sort of ripple effect if you're not enjoying what you're doing. And so I mean, I think that is a comprehensive way to to make the
Absolutely.
case that this is not just about, a life of whimsy, but yet things that are really, really important to what people want to achieve. And yet we've been groomed for so long through meritocracy and other, sort of social normative ideas that the best way to success is to grind it out, to do just a little bit better. So if your colleague who doesn't have kids and doesn't have domestic duties is there till 8 p.m., then sacrifice, your kid's soccer practice because you want to make sure you're there till 8:05. And we just
Mhm.
know that that's not true. But to wrap your head around working smarter, not harder, does it, it's kind of this chicken and egg issue, because you do need that psychological safety to be able to think big and figure out what working smarter means to you.
And the thing that's popping into my mind as you describe all of that is that a big piece of the puzzle is to be able to connect with purpose and meaning. If you understand why you're doing what you're doing and you derive satisfaction and meaning from it, then you're able to better do things like prioritize and know when you've done a good day at work, whatever that job is, to say, look, I knew what the important stuff was. I got it done. I can leave here. It's not a bad thing, rather than all of this is the same to me. I'm gonna use that word grind. I love it. I'm just gonna grind through until there's an arbitrary time when I think it looks good. And they're two very different experiences. And back in the dark ages when I was doing my doctorate, I was looking at work-life balance and spillover. And it's absolutely correct. The emotional work to non-work spillover that has a negative impact on our non-work relationships is really significant. We can bring a lot of that stuff with us, whether it's absence, we're psychologically still at work, or we're bringing the emotions with us and someone else is bearing the brunt of our bad mood. So the contagion bit is really, really important there. And if we flip that around, happiness, joy could spread, having fun could spread if we can normalize that. I guess I'm thinking of all the clients I've had over the years who have a very cynical eye on anything that might come between them and maximum productivity of their team members. So, what are the organizational benefits that we can sell to our stakeholders for more fun?
Yeah. One thing I want to add before we move on to that, though,
Mm,
is, and I'm sure you've covered it before, but a way to mitigate not bringing that sort of ill will home is a solid transition ritual, and
yeah.
it only costs you like 10 minutes. So if you do find yourself and you're just at the onset of this work, and you feel that angst and you're about to bring it into your home, just take a walk around the block. It's not going to solve everything, but it's amazing the folks that are able to put in those transition rituals, where they don't bring as much of that home. Because the problem is, if you do bring it home, then it's just waiting for you in the morning as well. And we see, that downward spiral happen so much faster. So,
Yeah, you're
um,
not getting that break from it. You're
yeah.
not getting the optimal rest and recovery that you might, and the distance from it all.
And I think the reason it was important for me to bring it up is the opportunity at home is much more advantageous for having fun. So if you're bringing your work home with you, then you really are eroding your ability to find enjoyment, at least in some spaces, right? Like if you're, again, in kind of a crisis care. And the only other thing I wanted to touch on, I think I had mentioned to you before we hit record, my mentor, Michael Gervais, has big ideas with regards to meaning and purpose and passion. And I think those things are important. But I often want to make sure that I delineate my work, because there are plenty of folks that are in positions where it's not aligned with their purpose. They're in a job, because they have to be. And in fact, I'm working on a TED Talk right now celebrating one of those people who was a single mom and had to find a job. So she just picked one, right? And so it ended up being a dental hygienist. And what she didn't realize on day one, when she actually got into the location, is that she was the worst part of people's day, right? So she here's a situation that's not fun for anyone, and not to her benefit, to the benefit of the folks that she served. And I'll shorten the story here, but she essentially found that as she kind of turned the environment into this silly little place, that she put everyone at ease. And so she wasn't an extrovert, but she was good at performative art. And she definitely didn't really think that that job was full of purpose. But because she was bringing fun into the workplace, it benefited her because of the way she was able to lift up the patients that she served.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
yes, purpose is important if you can find it.
Yeah.
Then it pairs well with also enjoying what you're doing, and it makes it easier. But it's not a requirement. So I just wanted to make sure I
That's an
delineate that.
important distinction. Absolutely. Absolutely.
With regards to organizations buying into this, I think I finally have data on my side. When I started this project in 2016, I really did, sort of have to sit on the soapbox and and preach. But luckily, and this did come out, so it's in the book, a huge study out of MIT, Stanford, and I think Oxford. Yeah, kind of. It's on the hedonic flexibility principle. If anyone wants to deep dive in that, Google. But I'll give you the elevator pitch. And essentially, what it found was that it was looking to sort of validate whether or not, if we are true pleasure seeking animals, right? Like, if we are enjoying what we're doing, does that just mean we're going to find more things that we want to enjoy to do? And what's the balance there? And so it shouldn't be a surprise that if we are depleted, if we're, burnt out from work, that as a generality, we look for poor ways to escape that pain, right? So what they found was, someone that's had a bad work day, or more likely, a bad work life, they'll look at things like going to the pub and kind of drowning that out, right? Things like mindlessly watching television just so they can escape this place that they're in. The surprising finding was the folks that are actually enjoying what they're doing, and that doesn't necessarily mean at work. Again, it goes back to those folks that might have a hard job, but know when the job is done. So they find, ways to enjoy themselves outside of the job because they know their fun cup is full. They're the ones that are now ready to go and find the harder challenges. So what is not true is that we're constantly pleasure seeking. What is true is that when we live a balanced, fun life, then we're poised to now accomplish and be more productive because we're like, that part of our bucket is full. So now let me go and attack the world because I feel psychologically safe. So in that context, finding out how to make an enjoyable environment at work, whether that's the employee that needs to do that for themselves or the leader that's trying to do a better job, all it's going to do is lift you up. And so that's at work. I think with regards to access to leisure, we're not, especially here in the States, I hate to be the role model for the worst possible scenario, right? But when Fortune 500 companies are literally paying employees to take their vacation because they know, one, it's a retention play, and two, they'll come back and do better work. I mean, it means that people are getting the message because we empirically know that folks that don't do that are going to burn out or they're going to attrit because they're going to equate the fact that they're not enjoying lives with their employer. And so we also know that giving access to leisure is an important component of employee well-being because, kind of the last thing I'll say about how bad it is here in the US, even though we're the second to last to giving access to leisure, only half of us take that meager amount.
Yeah.
1 out of 2 employees just never take a vacation year in and year out. And we know what is happening to those people that, again, aren't taking that. We're talking about minuscule amounts of time off the table for themselves, right?
No, I
And
don't get
so I think the last metaphor I'll use is, when we were having a real issue with sleep in the 90s, and I think that was outside of North America, a lot of folks were really celebrating the grind. And we quickly found out what happens with sleep deprivation, right? Even if you're an A type and you want to crush the day, you're a venture capitalist or whatever, if you don't get any sleep or you prop yourself up on stimulants, you're going to last a year or two until you completely crumble, right? Not enjoying life is a much slower burn, right? And so unfortunately it's insidious and it does require us to nuance what's going on here, but it's the same exact effect. And so there are 2 hangups here, right? There's the one that, okay, so I kind of get it, fun's important, but it's harder for me to understand. I get that because it's a longer game, right? The other are folks, to your point, the naysayers that are like, well, what's this guy talking about? He just wants, cake Mondays or whatever, like my employees to live a life of whimsy and never do their work. That's not it either. Just like we're not telling people to sleep 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
That's not the problem, right? The problem is nobody's enjoying ourselves. So we need to course correct the narrative right now so that your people feel better about themselves so that they can play the long game. So that when they do retire with, the limited amount of time they have left, that time is not spent regretting, all of what they gave away the last 25 years.
It's fun now, not jam tomorrow, and looking for those opportunities as we go along, not believing there's an ultimate destination that's going to be fine. And it also sounds like if you haven't been living a life that's like that, it's not magically going to appear as soon as you hit retirement either. It's almost like a habit that you need to build over time to know what fun is and how you can experience it so that when you do have more leisure time, you can do more of it.
Yeah. And the crazy part there too is when folks really fall into this category, especially if they're a dual income family, the amount of partners I've found that sort of retire together and then realize they don't even know each other because they didn't take 1 hour out of the week to have a dinner and kind of stay connected. And so sometimes that can be a good thing, right? Because you're essentially now dating an entirely new person as long as that works out. But
Mm,
sometimes it can be a horrible thing
mm.
because you two, people do grow apart when they don't spend time together. And so that's, another area a little bit deeper than the surface level stuff we've been talking about. But it is a true consequence about folks that don't prioritize, enjoying the time of the people that they care for. where they're like, this will all sort itself out, right?
Right.
Well, I meant we give most of our time in any given week to work. So we do need to figure out what are the safety rails outside of that.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I imagine, but I don't know for sure, but I imagine you don't have a three-part checklist that applies to everyone and how they have fun. But I can also imagine lots of people are wondering, how could I have more fun in my life? Well, what are your thoughts on that? Where's a good place for people to start?
And thank you for that, because I think a lot of folks do kind of, expect that. And like, you're a coach. There's always that joke, right? That we get paid by the arrow. So, of course I do have some frameworks, but no, that was what made this book extremely difficult, because I'll use a couple of geeky terms here,
Mm,
but essentially, fun in a scientific sense is the state of valence, right? Are we enjoying what we're doing and are we drawn to it? Or are we not enjoying what we're doing? Is it not fun? Are we repelled by it? And the preferences for that are going to be different across the board. And so having some broad based prescription that's going to work for everyone is just impossible. And so, how do you make these ideas simple? And so that was the challenge of the book. And I don't know that I hit a home run, but I tried my best, right? But I think where anyone can start is becoming mindful of how they spend their time. So I did create a model for this. It's available for free online. Just Google the Rucker play model. And it's just a way to figure out, like, are the things that I'm doing enjoyable and restorative, or is most of what I'm doing actually depleting? And so then you can use that model to ask better questions, right? So just to explain it real quick, the acronym is P.L.A.Y. And so the quadrants are pleasing, living, agonizing, and yield, right? And so we know that folks that aren't mindfully enjoying the things that they're doing tend to mind wander. So that's the pleasing category. And generally, all that is a mindset shift of like, hey, I like to do these things. And when I'm doing them, I'm going to make sure that I'm fully in them. My phone's going to be off, conversations with your kids, walking your dog, not scrolling Instagram, but enjoying the company of unconditional love of this pet that you really like. If you're in nature, actually taking that in,
mm,
right? And so those sort of simple things. The living quadrant gets a little bit more complex. It's really, for folks that are worried about personal growth. So those are things you really enjoy, but are harder to do. So you can't do them all the time. But if you're becoming mindful of your time and you can't name one thing in the living quadrant that you've done, in recent memory, then generally it's a nice invitation of like, I do want to do something. Like, even if it's going to a museum and really engaging in whatever that museum has to offer you, because it does match your preference. Like, if there's nothing that's leading to personal growth, that's a good question to ask, right? Like, why is that, and how could I get that in? And generally, that nudge is all it takes. Like, I'm just going to pre-commit to doing something now because I am embarrassed to say I haven't done anything, that really has been for my own betterment in the last year. The agonizing quadrant are the hard things that we have to do that really are depleting. And so, make it real clear in any of my work that we can't orchestrate our life, that those aren't going to be there.
mm.
And quite frankly, because I know you've been talking about flexibility, we almost do need some of those. For folks that have such a privileged life that they aren't there, I even say go find something, even if it's artificial, to put it there, so what hard work is, right? But a lot of us, if we are truly depleted and our life has too many of those agonizing activities, we can generally find ways to improve them in some way, whether that's to outsource them. And again, I know that's from a place of privilege, but oftentimes, folks that have a corpus of those are generally working too hard. So, if they value their time and kind of put an hourly rate, like, should you be, let's just say you're a creator, right? Should you be doing your own social media? Like, is that a good use of are you
Mhm.
enjoying it? Maybe
Mhm.
you are. And the answer is yes. But generally what I found is like, I'm auditing every one of my podcasts and doing the editing, and I hate it. Like, okay, well, there are a lot of people that enjoy doing that and can do it for a fairly nominal fee. And by the way, they're good at it. So
Mm.
it's taking you 2 hours, but they're going to do it in 15 minutes. Right. And so that's what I'm getting at with that. Once you identify them, generally you can create options to figure out not necessarily how to make it fun, but improve your experience. And then yielding has gotten a lot of attention. So when it first came out, I have to explain it, but I think most people know what that is. And that's anything where we're not indexing the memory, that where our brain knows it's not important enough, and that we're essentially generally just using that time to escape, the hard day, that we're trying to get out of that negative valent state. And we trick ourselves into thinking it might be enjoyable because now we're not uncomfortable, but it's nothing that's sort of what we call in psychology active leisure. Things like, social media scrolling.
Mm.
Right now, I will confess, because I am throwing rocks at the glass house, I'm doom scrolling because I'm uncomfortable about, certain aspects of the political environment. And
Mm.
so it helps me, but new information isn't going to solve that angst, right?
Mm.
And so if you think about it critically, what, because I know this tool is effective, I give myself 15 minutes a day to do that. I know that if I don't do it, right, it will be an infinite loop, but that if I don't put constraints on it, that it will suck up my time. And by putting constraints, now I can do something different that is fun because I've freed up that time. And so
Brilliant.
a real world example is I've given myself 15 minutes today before dinner because I know dinner is a true constraint where I can't say, oh no, just another 5 minutes because, my whole family will yell at me. And then I've made sure to make a date with my daughter to carve pumpkins. So pre-committing to a really enjoyable activity with her so I don't go back and start reading more political news is an example of how what would have been a yielding activity, for quite some time this evening has now turned into something fun because I've changed my circumstance. So that's how to use that kind of model. And it's really just a matter of being, mindful of how you spend your time. And for adults, why that's important, and I know you talk about this as well, is once we've habituated behavior, and that is useful for us because, if we were always trying to reinvent the system, we burn out probably faster than some of the other things that we talked about. But we do need to challenge that because once we get too ingrained into that, our brain just goes, okay, I know what to do and I don't need to encode any new information. And we know that one, we'll start to think that life is boring, but two, we're also not, there's no cognitive fitness happening and that really can have some consequences later in life.
Hmm. It really resonates with me, the point about being aware and intentional of how you spend your time, because it's the flip side of the pushback you hear a lot about. I don't have enough time. I don't have, I'm so busy, I can't do the things. But actually taking a step back and saying, well, yeah, how much time do I spend, with my phone just looking at people's holiday photos versus something that would actually bring me some genuine pleasure for the same amount of time? So being intentional and aware, it sounds like it's really important in this, rather than assuming at some point whatever you're doing might turn out to be fun.
Yeah. Well, because you're not flexing any agency or autonomy on that
Mm.
part, right? And that's been a central theme of our talk. Like, if you're not reclaiming that back, then you're essentially letting life happen to you. And what's unfortunate, it kind of pairs with Carl Dweck's work, is that then you really live through this paradigm of I have to do this. I have to do this for work. I have to do this for my family, which really doesn't feel great, right? We know that that doesn't lead to any sort of self-satisfying aspects of our life. In fact, there was a recent study, I'll give it to you to put in the show notes, where the number one predictor of life satisfaction are folks that are having fun. So it's an attribute of how they go about life. I can't yet, as a true academic, like discern that, if I prescribe you this, it's going to happen because, it's a qualitative attribute, but it is the number one correlate for life satisfaction. So for the folks that are kind of living, through this lens that life is happening to me and I have to do these things
Mm.
because of, quite frankly, probably maladapted social normative ideals that have been implanted, life is happening to them. But if you can reclaim some of that and they get to do this, even if it's only 3 or 4 hours out of that 168, then you really can create an upward spiral. And it doesn't have to grow from there. It's not about being accretive at that point. It's just about reclaiming those 3 or 4 hours so that, when you have a horrible week, you're like, this sucks, but I cannot wait to have dinner with Susie, my best friend, and I'm going to keep my mind there. And
Mm.
so, that's all it takes. None of this is profound, right? To your, I liked your sentiment. Like, this isn't a magic pill. We're not going to change your life overnight. But what we are going to do is get you out of that downward spiral so that you become self aware. And at the end of the day, you're like, I am in control of my life instead of, life happening to me.
You've made me remember my own podcast example from much earlier in the year. I found myself complaining to myself about I have to edit all this content and plan this program. And I stopped myself in my tracks and went, hold on. 10 years ago, this would have been your dream activity. You wanted the independence and the freedom to go out and do this. You get to do this. You're lucky to do this. Now enjoy it, and it was like a moment, a pivot in my mind where I realized, yeah, if you keep emphasizing the hassle factor, that's what you're going to feel. You're going to see it as a chore. But actually, that was a dream outcome for me. And I forgot that. I lost a connection with that. And now I really enjoyed it. I get to be creative, which, I need to look for those avenues to be creative more and more.
Yeah, I think I mean, there's so many low level interventions that can be really helpful. I call that story editing, but I think in a whole host of different situations, they can be helpful. Like in training, for example, if you just don't want to create another Lego castle, with your child, one, you could have a conversation with them, and we'll bring it back to work because I know that's the context of this. Like, you could talk to your colleague and, I don't necessarily want to do it this way. Can we figure out a way that works for both of us? But if it's something that you can't change, you can then focus on what is it that I'm doing this for? If you can't answer that question, maybe you shouldn't be doing the activity, right?
Mm,
But
bingo.
in your example, you absolutely knew what you were doing it for. And so you can celebrate that. Like, this isn't enjoyable, but what is going to be enjoyable is when I get this work product out. And so I'm going to enjoy the fact that this thing is difficult. Endurance athletes have coined this type 2 fun, right? So in the moment, it's not enjoyable, right? Like that crazy rock climbing where you're like, I think I'm going to die. How could I say this is fun? But you get to the top. And when you think back on that memory, even though that was hard, the corpus of that memory, even the hard bit where in the moment wasn't fun, is so enjoyable because now you can savor the entire experience. If you can't do that, right? Like, you get to the top of the mountain in this metaphorical example, and you're like, that was awful. And I hated the whole thing. Now you have good data too, right? Like,
Yes.
like I don't, in your example, which I know is not true, but in our hypothetical, why the F am I doing a podcast? Like, just doesn't sound
Exactly. Exactly. And that is that sort of experimental mindset that could be so helpful.
And I think this is a skill, so it's not going to work for everyone. And I've really borrowed a lot from John Cleese here. But if you can have a playful attitude in that, realm of self experimentation, so some things that are just like awful, where you're like, what am I doing? But you kind of do it with a snicker, knowing that you never have to do it again. That again, it's information, but the whole
Yeah.
thing is a game, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh my goodness, what did we get ourselves into? Like, let's never do this again.
Mhm.
But like the whole time, you're enjoying the process
Yeah.
because it's just ridiculous. Like, that is kind of the gold standard, right? But it does one require aspects of your personality to be able to have an experimental mindset. Some people just don't like are risk averse. I don't think there's any level of training that will get them there. So it's not, again, just want to be respectful that it's not going to be a pathway for everyone.
Absolutely.
Um, but if you can develop that skill, oh man, it makes everything enjoyable because you're like, oh, this whole idea of fail fast, right? Like, let's just figure it out quickly and let's enjoy the process, not get mad at each other, create psychological safety for mistakes, but then still be able to have an outcome, right? Like, you
Good.
are meant to win games. So I think people get hung up there too, right? Like, well, why would I want to fail? That isn't the end goal. We still have the goal is still to figure out how to make this successful. We're just creating a space that allows us to create the insight of what not to do so that we can continue to be successful, in the future. And especially with regards to information work, that can be a lot of fun, especially if you enjoy the people that you work with.
Mm, mm. I'm safe in the knowledge we could talk about this for hours, literally hours, and it's probably helpful that you are on another continent. Otherwise, I'd be at your door constantly wanting you to do that. We need to wrap up from purely from a time perspective. I'm being mindful about my time now. You can see it's rubbed off on me. Before we do, what's the final thing you'd like ringing in people's ears as we close this episode?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I've gotten more focused on like what is the one thing I want people to sort of, at least be seated in their mind. And I think what it is that we've been so conditioned, especially if we're talking about work, to look through the lens of productivity. How can I squeeze the most productivity out of every minute on my calendar, right? What is the hack that's going to be able to 10x my results? And
Yeah,
that's fine, right? Like we don't want to that has its place. But we really have never been very successful at looking at that same calendar and saying, how could I optimize this so that I'm really enjoying my week? And the huge benefit that that has with productivity. So it's not in spite of, it really is accretive, and something that pairs well with productivity is so important. So I would suggest that you do that exercise in whatever way feels good for you, whether you want to Google the P.L.A.Y model, and again, I'll give you that link for the show
great.
notes as well. Or if you want to get into a self-experimental mindset where you're starting to think like, okay, yeah, I'm productive in these areas, but how can I make it so that I actually want to do these things? That's an important place to start.
Fantastic. I am really interested to learn a lot more about all of this. So I look forward to following up on those links. Thank you for your time. I'd encourage our listeners and our viewers to get in touch. You can email me podcast@worklifepsych.com. I will forward the questions that we get through and the comments and the feedback. It's always great to hear from people. And if you're watching this on YouTube, just drop a comment below and we'll get back to you. But a whole bunch of things that Mike has shared with me that I'll put in the show notes. So please check those out. But for now, Mike, thank you so much for your time. It was great to speak with you again.
Likewise. Thank you for having me.